Hi, my name is Cara Rodriguez, and today I will present my project, The Volume of Paper Figures and Free Fall. First of all, the research question is how will the volume of a paper figure affect the time it takes to touch a floor from a certain defined distance? To start the objectives and the hypothesis, my main objective was to prove whether the volume of a figure affects the time it takes to touch a floor. And the small objectives that I had to follow were measure the paper sheets, create the figures, measure and guarantee that every object is produced with the same quantity of paper, measure and calculate the volume of each figure, measure the time it takes to complete the path, and compare the results and prove or refute the initial hypothesis, which is if the volume of a paper figure is bigger, then it will take longer to touch the floor because volume affects volume object velocity. Justification for this project is that I wanted to see terms that we review in physics class, such as free fall or gravity. And this one researches the relationship between volume, velocity, gravity, acceleration, and time. It's a project that I haven't seen previously elaborated, and it involves other areas such as mechanics and movement studies. For the introduction, I decided to put these definitions. Friction is a tangential force that opposes the sliding of an object. A resistance is the forces that are in the position to the relative motion of an object as it passes through the air. The volume is the space occupied within the boundaries of an object in three-dimensional space. And finally, the area is the space inside the boundary or a perimeter of a closed shape. The methodology I followed to do this experiment had to be with independent variable and dependent variable. The independent one was the volume of the objects, and this one was the one that I had to manipulate. And the dependent one was the time it took the object to touch the floor. Finally, the materials were sheets of paper, a ruler, a fluxometer, timer, scissors, and glue. And the methodology that I followed to do the experiment, first of all, I had to do the paper figures. I had to measure the area and calculate the volume. I had to find a high place to do the experiment. At the end, I chose a balcony in my house. That is, its height is 3.85 meters. The step 3 was to drop the objects and measure, number 4 was measure the time and obtain the results. And 5 was analyze them. And here I have the results and the data. The first figure that I had was the rectangular prism. First of all of them had the same surface area and all of them traveled the same distance. So the things that vary are the volume, the time, and the average speed. So for the first prism, the volume is 202.5 centimeters square, and it took 1.43 seconds. Thus, the average speed is 2.69 meters over second. Second is a triangular prism. The volume is 115.5. The time it took was 1.4 seconds, and the average speed was 2.75 meters per second. For the circular prism, the volume was 355.36 centimeters square, and it took 1.48 seconds. So the average speed was 2.60. For the pentagonal prism, the volume was 196.77. The time it took was 0.9, and the average speed was 0.27 meters per second. And for the hexagonal prism, the volume was 142.12. It took 0.94 seconds. And the average speed was 0.09. And finally, for the heptagonal prism, the volume was 222.2 centimeters square, and the time it took was 1.26. Thus, the average speed was 3.05. For the data analysis, I want to say again my hypothesis. If the volume of a paper figure is bigger, then it would take longer to touch the floor because the volume affects falling objects' velocity. We can say that in the analysis, I say that the rank between the volume is 239 centimeters square, and the time is 0.558 seconds. And there is no apparent relationship between the volume of each figure and the time it takes to reach the floor. Thus, it can be stated that this theory is incorrect, it is a hypothesis, and that it can be refuted after realization of this experiment. So the conclusions, there is no direct relationship between the volume of a paper figure and the time it would take to reach the floor from a certain height, but there was a variation in time and speed. It can be concluded that volume and area influence the time it takes the paper figure to reach the floor, but there is no direct relationship between volume and type. For the limitations for this project with air friction, time measurement, and precision, since I couldn't take milliseconds, so I think this would have given better results. And what is important for the scientific method? I think it's important because it guarantees results. It's a single format to define a lot of data science. It makes it easy to analyze the results, and thus it makes it easy to share and understand for others. And I learned from this activity and the relationship between I did in this project and what I learned. I learned that physics are always related. I learned how to establish an hypothesis and the importance of the scientific method. And I used different terms that we saw in physics class. These were the sources, and thank you so much for your attention.